Studio Ghibli, the makers of stunningly beautiful animation films such as Spirited Away, Rapture, Castle in the Sky, and My Neighbor Totoro, just to name a few. Many of the Ghibli films give me an intense hit of nostalgia because these are the films I grew up with, seeing as my parents are both Ghibli fans themselves. I have a deep appreciation for the art the Studio Ghibli team has created over the years. As a child, I enjoyed the imaginative greatness of the Ghibli films, more specifically Hayao Miyazaki's films. The way the world of each story immersed me into its complex, creative, and often crazy nature fascinated me, and now grown older, my admiration has only intensified. In this video, I want to analyze the photographic aspects of multiple Studio Ghibli films with the aim to find points which I can carry on into my photography. As you know, my medium of artistic expression is either photography, videography, or cinematography. Ghibli, on the other hand, focuses on animation. So, as I came to this idea of wanting to analyze the photography of Ghibli and transfer any lessons to photography, I came to the following thought about the differences between the two mediums. In photography, I either look for something interesting to photograph or I stage something interesting. Either way, I have to find real objects and/or people to bring my vision to life. On the other hand, in the case of Ghibli, in animation you start with nothing, a blank piece of paper. Animation is the creation out of nothing, whereas photography cannot be created without anything. So animation allows for full control over each and every aspect of the picture, giving the medium far more creative freedom than photography can. In animation, you have the power to create absolutely anything you can come up with, which of course is not possible in photography. Therefore, I was guessing that the photography of Ghibli must be a pretty much idealistic, perfected version of what photography can be. This is why I anticipate to find aspects from the photography of Ghibli to learn from and adapt to my photography if possible. I want to structure my analysis in 6 categories. 1. The content. What is shown in the scene. 2. The composition. Where and how are subjects and objects placed. 3. The lighting. How does Studio Ghibli light their scenes and handle contrast? 4. The color. How are the colors chosen and used in the films? 5. The texture. How is a variety of texture used? And finally, 6. The mood and emotionality of the scene. Before I start, let me explain that in this video I'm concentrating on the films and art of director and animator Hayao Miyazaki. I am aware that there are films by Studio Ghibli from other directors, but those most influential to me are all from Miyazaki, which is why I would like to concentrate on those in this essay. With that said, let's begin the analysis by looking at the content of photography in various Ghibli films. Most films by Miyazaki contain a decent portion of surrealism. Okay, maybe a lot of surrealism. The point I'm trying to make is that this component is of course only partially realizable in photography, but apart from all the whimsical creatures, the films often show wide landscapes, a burningly orange sunset, a vast sea, simply a house, or Kiki repairing her broomstick. Miyazaki has this way of showing an array of normalities along these, well, I'll call these abnormalities, in the same film. The films distance themselves from the reality we know, but the characters, they don't, they stay relatable. So even though Miyazaki possesses the power to create anything, he does not hesitate to give just as much attention to the mundane. This still, from My Neighbor Totoro, is a simple interior shot of a room. In it is a table with a pot of tea and some cups, a newspaper, and some magazines. There's nothing exciting or fantastic about the contents of this picture, yet I think it is fascinatingly beautiful. I feel pulled into this house, imagining what life in this place could be like. Because no one is in the photo, the room feels quiet and peaceful, but not lonely at the same time because the light is on, which implies that somebody is here. It gives me this feeling of tranquility and lets me dream about a place without worries, as corny as this may sound. And I think this shows that for great photography to be created, nothing extraordinary is needed. And this still is no exception throughout Miyazaki's work. Check out this still from Kiki's delivery service. The scene is simply Kiki in this rather unspectacular room eating breakfast. Another example is this still from Howl's Moving Castle. The darkly lit room, which again feels empty, is just beautiful. A great photograph isn't just great because it shows a stunning landscape, greatness can be achieved by many other factors. This is a point that I've observed to be often forgotten among photographers, thus I'm spreading this message with examples from Ghibli films which have been globally praised not only for the stories, but also the visuals. Let's continue with the second point I want to touch on, the composition. Interestingly, but at the same time not surprisingly, the composition in the photography of Ghibli films isn't too different to what is achievable in photography. The idea of being able to create anything imaginable applies here just as much. But it doesn't separate animation from photography because composition is, simply put, the decision of placement of each element in the photograph. Of course, Miyazaki impresses with fabulously balanced images and also a sense of scale and depth. I love the ultra-wide shots he often incorporates as the establishing shot for a new scene, which often show the characters in a small, if not tiny size compared to the world they are set in. Various compositional techniques are used to enhance the sense of depth in the scenes, which is of course especially important in 2D animation. The techniques are just as common in photography, seeing as the medium is also a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space. Objects are separated in foreground, midground, and background. Leading lines support the perspective. Motion blur is used to show the direction of movements. Something I personally enjoy a lot when referring to the composition is Miyazaki's way of composing interior shots. Interior shots are something I find myself struggling with, therefore I'm all the more impressed and satisfied when I see how well photographers, cinematographers, or in this case animators, can execute these kind of compositions. Let's move on to the third category I want to discuss, the lighting. This element of photography strongly benefits from the capability of creating anything out of nothing when speaking of animation. Miyazaki of course takes full advantage of this and creates stunningly beautiful lighting situations for his scenes. What I as a photographer wish to find and try to predict with the weather forecast, Miyazaki simply creates it whenever he wants, however he wants. He seems to enjoy sunsets and sunrises, which he often decorates with clouds colored by the sunlight. However, he doesn't hesitate to show sceneries in broad daylight, which can be difficult in photography, but in animation, the artist has full control over the dynamic range and the contrast. Additionally, the lighting doesn't have to be perfectly realistic to be believable. If we take a look at this still from My Neighbor Totoro of Mei, Satsuki and their dad hanging up clothes, we can clearly see which issues a photographer would encounter. Harsh sunlight onto faces creates harsh shadows which often do not look pleasing on faces. In the film, however, Miyazaki can simply relinquish the shadows without making the lighting look strange or unrealistic. A lighting effect Miyazaki likes to use are light rays. In real life, as a photographer, there are multiple meteorological factors that need to come together to enable such effects. Miyazaki, of course, can create them as he likes, and he does so beautifully. One more point concerning lighting I would like to mention is his way of lighting interior shots and how he handles artificial light in general. Let's go back to this still from My Neighbor Totoro. Miyazaki approaches the lighting here similarly as many cinematographers like to approach their interior lighting, with practicals. In this particular case, he chose a round lamp that hangs from the ceiling. I love how the warm light falls down onto the scene and spreads across the room, slowly fading weaker until in the upper corners of the room there is only darkness. However, I don't know if this setup would realistically work on set. I imagine the light would be harsher and the shadow areas of the scene darker. Let's continue with the next section for analysis, the colors. As discussed in the previous categories, Miyazaki can create anything that comes to his mind, which he certainly makes use of when coloring his films. The films show a wide range of color palettes from shots like this one, which are bright, colorful, strongly saturated, to shots like this, which are kept more monochromatic with less saturation. Something I've observed across the films is that generally, the brighter the scene is, so for example this scene in broad daylight, the more saturated the colors get. This is of course only very generally speaking, there are many exceptions, however I do find that this can be often seen in the films. Overall, the colors in Ghibli films are mostly pretty saturated to the point that in photography it would probably be a little too much. However, because Miyazaki's medium is animation and his films usually are supernatural, I think slight oversaturation is actually quite fitting. When Miyazaki tries to convey a dramatic event, he doesn't hesitate to go really strong with the colors, as seen with the reds of the fire in this still from Howl's Moving Castle, or the teal colors in this still from Castle in the Sky. All in all, I'd describe Miyazaki's use of color somewhere between naturalistic and exaggerated. He chooses colors precisely to evoke a sense of realism in his work, which immerses the viewer into the worlds he creates. But at the same time, he tends to exaggerate the colors and advance beyond reality to enable a supernatural experience. And that I love, and so I would like to experiment intentionally in my photography with these methods. Let's move on to the next point, the textures. I don't know when you last saw a Ghibli film by Hayao Miyazaki, but maybe you remember that sometimes he implements some pictures in his films which have a noticeably different texture. I haven't found a reason for this. I don't know whether he's even ever publicly explained it. I think one of the more known or remembered scene in reference to the texture is the introduction sequence in Rapida, Castle in the Sky. By adding lines and such details, Miyazaki creates this textured feeling that looks a bit like this art was painted onto wood. However, he also practices textural changes in a more subtle way. The amount of detail in each new scene varies. Some shots are drawn really precisely by adding textures to each object and fleshing out little details, which as a whole convey a sense of realism. Other shots don't even require the same amount of detail due to the nature of what is shown, but still look realistic. But on the other hand, many shots are drawn in more of this characteristic anime look, which doesn't regard the aspect of realism as much. There are far less textures, the image overall has more of a plain look, and many details are relinquished. I find it pretty impressive how the films successfully combine the different styles without falling apart because of the changes. It flows together nicely. Here's a comparison of contrasting styles I want to show you to demonstrate this point. These three stills are all from Rapida, Castle in the Sky. What we can see here are the shot to the left, which demonstrates the less detailed style. The two characters and the vehicle are mostly drawn with solid colors differing in the shades, which do not change in a gradient, but instead with a simple cut from one color to the other. The background, on the contrary, is a gradient from dark to lighter red and orange tones. The only more textured element in this still are the wings of the vehicle, which are drawn as lines to represent motion blur. The frame in the middle is a much more detailed still from the film, which is drawn in a more realistic style, although of course the strong light rays can definitely be considered to look unrealistic. However, we can certainly state that this still could be a standalone artwork which doesn't stem from an animation film, whereas the previous photo looks much more like a typical anime. And lastly, to the right, here is another still with yet again a different texture. The motivation for the change of style here is pretty clear. If you've seen the film, you might remember that this was a flashback scene in which the robot was explained that fell from the sky. To support the flashback, this warm, earthy look with the more clearly visible drawn style, or possibly even somewhat of a pencil look, was applied. The point I think I, as a photographer, can take from this is the effectiveness of textures and how they can change the feeling and meaning of your photography. I personally always add grain to my photos, which gives it a special texture, but this can be taken further with texture overlays such as paper, dust, or scratches. Let's finish off this essay with the last category, the mood or feeling Miyazaki creates with his art. This last point is rather difficult to define or to narrow down objectively because I am of course biased by the films, which create the feeling not only with the imagery but also with the music, the story, and the characters. But all in all, throughout many of his films, he creates a feeling of wonder, adventure, hope, and awe. He often lets us see and feel how big the world is and how tiny we humans are, and the sheer amount of exploration that is possible in this world which we could never explore in one human lifespan. When the aspects of surrealism and fantasy are added to the pictures, the photography can give this feeling of bringing back childhood and the imaginativeness we had as a child. I don't exactly know what or how this last point can be applied for my own work, except as deeply appreciated inspiration. I hope this analysis and essay could connect the two mediums for you and possibly inspire you to create something that has grown out of all the fascinating art the Ghibli films have given us. I personally had a lot of fun going over these films again after not having seen them in a long while and now trying to pick out little things I can learn for my own craft. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, I'd appreciate a like, it helps the channel grow, consider subscribing if you haven't yet, and I'll hopefully see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.